Welcome to this short guided tour through Paul's first letter to the Corinthians. In a couple of weeks' time, we're going to begin a series of sermons at St Mary's in which we'll be looking at some, although not all, of this great letter. We'll have our first sermon on the 24th of January, and those sermons will continue until the beginning of Lent. And then after Easter, we'll resume the series and look at more of 1 Corinthians. And each week there'll be material which home groups can use to follow up the sermon. In this introductory session, we're going to have a quick look at a bit of the history and geography of Corinth. We'll have a look at Acts chapter 18, which tells us about how Paul first visited Corinth and began his relationship with the people there. We'll look at the circumstances in which Paul wrote this letter. Why did he write it? And then we'll make a quick journey through the letter and see what issues Paul thought it was important to write about. So let's begin with some geography. Thanks to Google Maps, we can see how Corinth was a place of huge strategic importance. It was on an isthmus, a narrow neck of land just 4.5 miles across, which joined mainland Greece to the Peloponnese, the bit to the south. Now, for ships sailing from Italy to Asia, or Turkey as we now call it, going round the Peloponnese was the equivalent in the ancient world of going round Cape Horn. It was to be avoided, if at all possible. So ships from Italy would sail to Corinth. They'd unload their cargo, which would then be taken by a paved road across the 4.5 miles to the port on the other side of the isthmus. Then it would be loaded onto another ship, and the journey could continue. And as we zoom in, we can see how nowadays that loading and unloading isn't needed. There's a canal, the Corinthian Canal, to enable ships to sail straight through the isthmus. Now Corinth, that very significant port, it had been a great city for hundreds of years, and then in 146 BC it was destroyed by the Romans. But in 44 BC it was refounded by the Romans. Julius Caesar refounded it as a Roman colony. And its strategic position there as a port that meant that once again it had lots of commercial traffic. And that led to an economic boom, meaning that by the time Paul wrote this letter, it was probably one of the biggest cities in the Roman Empire. Now, money attracts people, and people from many parts of the world went to Corinth. That meant, amongst other things, that there were lots of religious influences there. Greek influences, Roman influences, influences from other parts of the world. And in chapter 8, verse 5, Paul talks about there being many gods and many lords there in Corinth. And the religious mix included Jews, with their quite extraordinary belief that there was only one God. And we know that there was a synagogue there. We can read about it in Acts chapter 18, and that's backed up by archaeological finds. But that combination of wealth and 2 seaports almost guaranteed that in Corinth there was a fairly licentious lifestyle. There was a Greek verb to Corinthianize, and that verb meant to commit fornication, to indulge in any and every sort of sexual immorality. The word really derived from its life in previous centuries. And in Paul's time, Corinth was probably no worse than any other seaport where there was lots of money. But that was pretty bad. Now, from that little bit of geography and history, let's now move on and have a look at Paul's involvement with Corinth, how he came to have his relationship with the people in the church there. The story really begins in Acts chapter 16 when Paul with Mark sets out on his second missionary journey. They begin from what is in effect Paul's home church, which is Antioch. And as they set out from Antioch, they revisit some of the places they'd been to on the first missionary journey. They travel through Asia, otherwise known as Turkey, and they journey on until they reach the port of Troas. While he's in Troas, Paul has a vision. He sees a man from Macedonia, that's northern Greece, and this man from Macedonia says to him, "Come over to Macedonia and help us." So Paul and Mark set sail and they leave Troas and head for Macedonia, Philippi, the first time the Gospels reached Europe. From there they carry on. They visit Thessalonica, Athens, that's chapter 17, and then chapter 18, they arrive in Corinth. So let's have a look at Acts chapter 18. Verse 1 tells us how Paul arrives in Corinth on that second missionary journey of his. And verses 2 and 3 tell us how Paul arrived in Corinth, finds somewhere to stay with Priscilla and Aquila, two very important figures in the early church. Paul works with them. All three of them are tent makers. Verse 4, on the Sabbath, Paul can take the day off and preach in the synagogue. But then verse 5 tells us that Silas and Timothy arrive, enabling Paul now to preach full time. And this is because they bring a gift of money from the church in Philippi. See Philippians 4:15 or 2 Corinthians 11:8 to tell us about that. This means that he no longer needs to work to support himself. Verse 6, opposition from Paul's Jewish listeners call him to focus on preaching to the Gentiles. But, verse 8, there is one significant Jewish convert, Crispus, the leader of the synagogue. Verse 11, Paul stayed 18 months, the longest he'd ever stayed anywhere. And presumably this was because he saw this as a strategic place, a crossroads from which the gospel will be able to spread in all directions. Now, Paul's time in Corinth was an encouraging one. Verse 8, many people become believers. Verses 9 and 10, he has a vision of Jesus to encourage and reassure him, with a promise that he'll be protected from harm. And verses 12 to 17, Jewish people complain that he's introducing ideas not permitted by Roman religious legislation, but the case is thrown out by the Romans. Verse 12 mentions Gallio, the Roman governor, and archaeologists have found an inscription saying that Gallio was the governor from AD 51 to 52. So that enables us to put some sort of date on this time that Paul spent in Corinth. When he left Corinth, Paul completed that second missionary journey of his, ending up back at his home church in Antioch, where presumably he gave them a full account, probably a very excited account, of everything that had happened and everything that he'd seen God doing. But before too long, he was off on his travels again, on his third missionary journey. And during this journey, he spent a long time in Ephesus. He spent something like 3 years there. And almost certainly it was during this time in Ephesus that he wrote this letter. He says in 1 Corinthians 16 verse 8, I will stay on in Ephesus until Pentecost. And that probably means that he wrote it in AD 55. And this makes it one of the earliest documents in the New Testament, written before the 4 Gospels were written. And probably only Galatians and 1 and 2 Thessalonians were written earlier than 1 Corinthians. So what were the circumstances in which Paul wrote this letter? Why did he write it? Well, it seems he was responding to news that he'd received of how things were going in Corinth. Chapter 1 tells us that he'd received some reports from people from Chloe's household, including the fact, this is chapter 1 verse 11, some from Chloe's household have informed me, and what they'd informed him of included the fact that there were divisions in the church. And then Paul had received a letter from the Corinthians. Chapter 7 verse 1, he says, Now for the matters you wrote about. And the first of those matters he tackles in chapter 7 is marriage. But then on subsequent occasions he says, now about... So in beginning of chapter 8, for example, now about food sacrificed to idols. Or chapter 12, now about spiritual gifts. Or chapter 16, now about the collection for God's people. There we assume he's picking up on other matters raised in their letter. And then one other thing, he'd been visited by Stephanus Fortunatus and Achaicus, chapter 16, verse 17. It may be that they are the people who brought the letter mentioned in chapter 7, but inevitably they'll have brought news from Corinth as well, which may have raised some issues that Paul wanted to respond to. So Paul had lots to respond to, and in fact he had already sent one letter. Chapter 5, verse 9, he says, I wrote to you in my letter not to associate with sexually immoral people. So he had already written to them, a letter the biblical scholars often refer to as the previous letter. We don't know what it was, but it means that Paul was continually in touch with the Corinthians. Lots then for Paul to respond to. So what's actually in this letter? Well, it begins like Paul's other letters. He says who it's from and who it's to. He gives an opening greeting to his readers, and he gives them a prayer report. He tells them what it is that he's been praying for them. But once that introduction's over, this letter goes off in a different direction from his other letters. Because many of the other letters have a section of theology, followed by a section in which Paul tells them how to live that theology out in practice. Theology leads to ethics. Romans is a very clear example of this. 11 chapters of theology, quite heavy theology. And then chapter 12, verse 1, Paul says, therefore, and leads it on to saying how, as disciples of Jesus, that theology should be put into practice in their lives. Ephesians is a similar shape, 3 chapters of theology, and then chapter 4, verse 1, the turning point where Paul turns to practical Christian living. But here in 1 Corinthians, Paul just dives straight in and tackles the practical issues that have been raised by what he's heard and by what they wrote in their letter to him. How should they live as Christians in Corinth? What bits of Corinthian culture, what bits of Greek or Roman ways of thinking need to be jettisoned as they develop a new mindset and start thinking and acting in a way that shows they've absorbed the good news about Jesus and that they've allowed him to turn their lives around? So let's now have a whistle-stop tour through the letter and see some of these key issues that Paul tackles and some of the key points that he makes. The first matter that Paul raises is the divisions in the church in Corinth. This starts at chapter 10 of verse 1 and carries on through chapter 4. And he details what he sees are the problems in the church there. First of all, that there are factions. Some people say, I follow Paul. Others say, no, I follow Apollos. Or I follow Cephas, that's Peter. Or I follow Christ. And then he talks about the problem of the idea of wisdom, something which the Greeks loved. Their word was sophia, and it meant lovely flowery language, rhetoric. They loved to go and listen to people speaking in public. But Paul didn't speak in the sort of flowery language that they liked. He kept it simple. He just wanted to tell people about Jesus and what he'd done. I resolved to know nothing while I was with you, except Jesus Christ and him crucified. Now, the idea of God's Son being killed, the idea of the cross, might seem ridiculous to many people in Corinth. It might seem foolish for God to act in that way. But, says Paul, the foolishness of God is wiser than human wisdom. And there were poor attitudes to leadership. The fact that people were tending to have favourite leaders, to be claiming to follow one particular leader, suggests that they didn't actually understand what Christian leadership's all about. Because the leaders, Paul, Apollos, Cephas, they're all servants and they're all united. So in response to these divisions in the church, Paul's saying, focus on Jesus. Don't focus on the preachers. Focus on the Jesus they preach about. Focus on Christ crucified. Instead of having divisions, be united in rejoicing that he died for you. And then in chapters 5 and 6, the next section really covers two issues, immorality and litigation, because these are two examples of where the church in Corinth seems to have failed to stand out as different from the world around it. In chapter 5, he talks about how sexual immorality has been taking place. And Paul expresses his shock both that it could ever have happened and that the church doesn't seem to be too bothered about it. In chapter 6, he talks about how church members have been taking each other to court. Again, he has shock both at the fact that there are such disagreements and shock at the way in which they're handled. And then chapter 6 ends with him saying that the underlying problem seems to be that they've completely misunderstood the idea of Christian freedom. It isn't a license to do anything they want, especially when it comes to sexual immorality, which once again, because Corinth's the place it is, that's an ongoing issue. Do you not know that your bodies are temples of the Holy Spirit, who is in you, whom you have received from God? You are not your own. You were bought at a price. Therefore, honour God with your bodies. Paul there is opposing the way that Greeks would have thought, that the body is irrelevant and only the spirit matters. This is something that can't be true for the Christian, because the whole person has been redeemed by Christ, and the whole person, including the way we use our bodies, should honour God. So those were the issues that arose from what Paul heard from the people from Chloe's household. And now he turns to issues that were raised in the Corinthians letter to him. And first of all, chapter 7, all about marriage. And in this chapter there are a number of matters. Is it good to be celibate within marriage? Should single people and widows be looking to get married? Is divorce acceptable? And what about a marriage where one is a believer and the other one isn't? Should they separate? And in his answers, Paul, he affirms sex as an essential part of the marriage relationship. You shouldn't be denigrating the physical over against the spiritual. He also affirms singleness. And he speaks clearly about the mutuality of the marriage relationship. For some people, Paul has a bit of a reputation of being a bit of a misogynist, but there's not a hint of that here. Whatever he says about the husband in relation to the wife, he says exactly the same thing about the wife in relation to the husband. And one little interesting thing to note here, in verse 10, he says, "Not I, but the Lord." On the particular issue there, this isn't me giving my personal opinion, this is what the Lord says. And then a few verses later, verse 25, when speaking about another issue, he says, "I have no command from the Lord, but I give a judgment as one who by the Lord's mercy is trustworthy." We don't have a word from the Lord on this. Here I'm giving you my opinion. Then in chapters 8 to 10, the main topic here is food sacrificed to idols, something that doesn't sound very relevant to us in Ely in the 21st century, but there is an important point here. Now, there were lots of pagan temples in Corinth, and they were at the heart not only of religious life, but also of cultural and social life. Many a family meal and many a business dinner would take place in a pagan temple. It was a great place to eat out. So food in a pagan temple, food that had been sacrificed to an idol, that was almost inevitably going to be an issue for Christians in Corinth. Now, on the one hand, they didn't want to have anything to do with the worship of idols or pagan gods. On the other hand, they had a wonderful new freedom to do whatever they liked. And there was a particular concern that if Christians enjoying their freedom to eat what they wanted did eat food sacrificed to idols, then that could cause others who were perhaps very young in the faith, it could cause them to stumble. And so Paul's general principle here, enjoy your freedom to eat whatever you like, but always exercise your freedom with love. Think about the effect that your actions will have on others. In chapter 11, he talks about a couple of issues arising in Christian gatherings. In the first half of the chapter, he talks about the conduct of men and women in the Christian assembly. The question isn't whether women should be taking part. Paul assumes that they will be, that they'll be praying and prophesying. The question, which seems absolutely trivial to us, is whether they should cover their heads as they do so. And here's a classic case, I think, of where we have to try and work out whether this is something addressed just to a particular local situation, or whether it's something that applies to all times and cultures, or whether there is perhaps some underlying general principle that it's important for us to pay heed to. Second half of chapter 11 is about the Lord's Supper. The common practice then was for Christians to meet together for a meal, and as part of the meal they'd share bread and wine as Jesus had done at the Last Supper. But it seems that some people, probably the better off ones, got there early and got stuck into the food and drink, and that there was nothing left by the time the poorer members of the church arrived. And Paul says, think of those poorest members. Wait for each other. And he says, remember what the Lord's Supper, Holy Communion, is all about. It's about remembering Jesus. It's about remembering that he died for us and all the things that his dying made possible for us. And it's a communal meal. It should be something which expresses our unity in Jesus. Chapters 12 to 14 are about spiritual gifts. And it seems that spiritual gifts, especially the gift of tongues, those gifts were very highly prized by the Christians in Corinth. In chapter 12, Paul begins by reminding them the test of whether someone's a Christian isn't whether they speak in tongues, it's whether they say, Jesus is Lord. And he reminds them there is in fact a whole great diversity of gifts, and he gives them a list of examples. And then he gives them the picture of the body, probably Paul's favourite metaphor for the church. A metaphor which makes it clear that there are lots and lots of different people with lots and lots of different gifts. And in the church, the body of Christ, there's unity in diversity. In chapter 14, he speaks specifically about how gifts are used within worship. The gift of tongues was, it seems, very highly prized, but if no one interpreted what was said in tongues, no one would be able to understand it. And Paul stresses the need for things to be understood. Things must be intelligible. If they are, then that will lead to the edification, the strengthening, the building up of the believers who hear it. And it can also lead to the conversion of any non-believers who are present. And it's important to have orderliness in worship. If, for example, the gifts of tongues and prophecy are being used in the gathering, then let's make sure we don't have several people all speaking at the same time. And let's not forget chapter 13. Sandwiched between chapter 12 and chapter 14, two great chapters about our God-given gifts, is this famous chapter, the chapter all about love, reminding us that love must govern the way that all gifts, including the gift of tongues, are used. And then in chapter 15, one final big issue, resurrection. And Paul here latches on to the fact that some people in the church in Corinth seem to have doubts about the promise of resurrection. And he gets straight down to basics. Right at the heart of the gospel is the amazing fact that Christ was raised from the dead. What I received from you, I passed on to you. This isn't something that I've invented, this gospel, and you're not free to invent anything of your own. And here's the thing, he says, if Christ was raised from the dead, then you can be sure that we too will be raised. You can share in his resurrection. The great day will come when we'll gain our resurrection bodies. That'll mean both continuity and transformation. I'll still be me and recognisable as me, but I'll be transformed into something new and glorious. And this will be the final victory over death. The great day will come when Jesus returns and we gain our resurrection bodies. It'll be the final complete victory over death, a victory that was guaranteed by the original victory of Jesus and his resurrection. Death has been swallowed up in victory. Where, O death, is your victory? Where, O death, is your sting? I said earlier that 1 Corinthians is mostly about ethics, the practicalities of life as a Christian, rather than it being about heavy theology. But there are some very clear theological bookends. Back at the beginning, in chapters 1 and 2, Paul had a lot to say about the cross and his resolve to preach about Christ crucified. And now here in the penultimate chapter, he writes at length about Jesus' resurrection and its implications for us. So Jesus' death and his resurrection, theological bookends of this great letter, which is above all a pastoral letter. So 1 Corinthians, it's a letter full of advice for the Christians in Corinth. But there's lots for us too, about avoiding divisions, about focusing on Jesus and the cross, about leadership, about marriage, about the Lord's Supper, Holy Communion, about the use of our gifts within the life of the church, the body of Christ, about the importance of love in all that we do, about the centrality of the resurrection to our faith and our Christian hope. There's a final chapter, chapter 16, and in it Paul mentions the collection which he's taking for the church in Jerusalem. He talks about his plans to visit Corinth again, and then there are his closing greetings and prayer. And so the letter ends. He's had a lot of quite hard things to say, criticising some of the things that they've been doing, having to put them right on some matters of Christian behaviour. But he's writing above all as a pastor, and everything he's said quite lovingly and gently. Later on, he's going to have to be firmer. We see that in 2 Corinthians. 2 Corinthians 2 verse 4, I wrote to you out of great distress and anguish of heart and with many tears. And 2 Corinthians 7 verse 8, even if I caused you sorrow by my letter, I don't regret it. Though I did regret it, I see that my letter hurt you, but only for a little while. And that last quote, it implies that there was another letter that Paul felt that he had to write to them, a letter we don't know what it is, but biblical scholars often refer to it as the severe letter. But in 1 Corinthians, he's not severe, he's very gentle with them as he rebukes them. And he ends the letter in the warmest of ways. Greet one another with a holy kiss. The grace of the Lord Jesus be with you. My love to all of you in Christ Jesus. Amen.